The wind howled through the snow-covered streets of Silver Ridge, a small Colorado town nestled in the shadows of the Rocky Mountains. Dominic's worn work boots crunched against the icy gravel as he loaded his toolbox into the back of his old, battered truck. The vehicle groaned in protest, its rusted body a testament to years of overwork. He glanced at his watch, then at the faint light streaming from the second-story window of their modest home. Inside, his 7-year-old daughter, Alice, was likely finishing breakfast, a simple routine that had become their anchor in a life otherwise riddled with challenges. Dominic took a deep breath, his breath forming a fleeting cloud in the frigid air. Another day, another dollar, he thought, though even that felt optimistic. The garage he owned was struggling, and each passing month brought new financial hurdles. As he climbed into the driver's seat, a voice called from the doorway. "Dad, you forgot your gloves!" Alice darted out, her oversized scarf trailing behind her like a cape. She handed him the gloves with a bright smile that momentarily warmed the cold morning. "Thanks, kiddo," Dominic said, ruffling her hair. "You're my lifesaver." He dropped Alice off at school, her giggles and chatter filling the air, before heading toward a repair job at the edge of town. The drive was uneventful, the snow blanketing the roads in an eerie stillness. But as he turned a bend near the tree-lined highway, he spotted something unusual. A sleek black sports car, its hazard lights blinking against the grey morning. Pulling over, Dominic stepped out, his breath catching in the biting wind. A woman stood beside the car, her figure wrapped in a long, stylish coat that seemed better suited for a runway than the rugged outdoors. She was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear, frustration etched into her elegant features. The look in her eyes shifted as she noticed him approaching, half wary, half hopeful. "Need some help?" Dominic called, his voice steady despite the frigid air. The woman paused, lowering her phone. Her sharp features softened slightly as she regarded him. "Yes, thank you," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "My car just stopped. I've been trying to call roadside assistance, but they said it'll be hours before someone can get here." Dominic nodded, already sizing up the situation. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. The woman hesitated, then stepped aside. "Please, be my guest. I'm Belle, by the way." Dominic introduced himself as he popped the hood, his practiced hands deftly maneuvering around the unfamiliar machinery of the high-end vehicle. Belle observed him, intrigued by his calm efficiency, despite the cold gnawing at their surroundings. After a few minutes, Dominic straightened, brushing the frost off his gloves. "It's the ignition coil," he said. "Simple enough fix for now, but you'll need a proper repair soon." Belle's eyes lit up with gratitude. "You've saved me a lot of trouble. How can I repay you?" Dominic waved her off, his tone brisk yet kind. "No need. Just glad to help." Belle frowned, not entirely convinced by Dominic's casual dismissal of her gratitude. She reached into her designer bag, but Dominic held up a hand. "Really, it's fine," he insisted. "Just part of being neighborly." The corners of her lips lifted into a faint smile. "Neighborly? Not sure how many neighbors carry a full toolbox in their truck." Dominic chuckled, closing the hood of the car with a decisive thud. "Around here we have to be prepared for just about anything." He turned toward his truck, brushing the snow off his boots. "If it starts acting up again, my garage is about 5 miles back. Cooper's Auto Repair. Won't find luxury, but it gets the job done." Belle studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes softening. "I might just do that. Dominic, right?" He nodded, pulling his gloves tighter over his fingers. "Yep, and you're Belle." "Correct," she replied, her tone playful yet poised. She paused before climbing back into her car, her expression shifting. "Thank you, Dominic. I mean it." He gave a small nod, stepping back as the car roared to life under his direction. Belle waved as she drove off, the sleek vehicle disappearing into the snowy horizon. Dominic stood there a moment longer, watching the space where her car had been. There was something about her, a confidence that bordered on untouchable, yet beneath it, he sensed a flicker of something more. Vulnerability, perhaps. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. She was just another stranded motorist after all. Back in his truck, Dominic turned the heater up, savoring the warmth as he resumed his route. The job ahead wasn't much, an old pickup needing a replacement fan belt, but it was the kind of work that kept the lights on, at least for now. Still, his mind lingered on the encounter with Belle. Her polished demeanor and expensive car were so far removed from his world that it was almost laughable. And yet, she hadn't been condescending or dismissive, just human. That wasn't something he encountered often in people with her level of apparent success. By the time he arrived at the job site, the memory of the roadside interaction was already fading into the background noise of his day. But Dominic didn't know that their paths weren't meant to diverge. Instead, Belle Carter, the poised stranger he had helped on a whim, was about to steer his life in a direction he could never have anticipated. The soft chime of the bell above the garage door was drowned out by the whirring of an old air compressor and the rhythmic clanging of tools. Dominic wiped his grease-streaked hands on a worn rag, barely glancing up as a familiar customer walked in. It was another day of repairs at Cooper's Auto Repair, and the usual monotony felt like a constant reminder of the garage's struggles. Bills were piling up, and business was slow. Yet, as always, Dominic soldiered on. "Hey, Jake," Dominic called over the noise. "Can you check on that alternator? I think it's ready to go." Jake Simmons, his lanky assistant, gave a mock salute, a grin breaking through the grease smudged on his face. "On it, boss." Dominic shook his head with a faint smile and turned back to the car he was working on, a rusted-out sedan that had seen better decades. He was so focused on the stubborn bolt refusing to budge that he didn't notice the sleek black car pulling into the garage until the engine cut off and silence filled the room. The door to the sports car opened and Belle stepped out, her designer coat and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to the oil-stained tools and cluttered workbench. Dominic blinked, momentarily surprised by her presence. "Belle," he said, standing upright and brushing his hands on his already dirty jeans. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." She offered a small smile, glancing around the garage. "I thought it was only fair to say thank you properly." She gestured to the wicker basket she carried, filled with neatly wrapped baked goods. "I figured you could use a little something to keep you going." Dominic hesitated, a mix of surprise and mild embarrassment flickering across his face. He wasn't used to gestures like this, especially from someone like her. "You didn't have to go out of your way," he said, but his voice softened as he added, "Thanks. I appreciate it." Jake appeared from behind a car, his curious gaze flicking between Dominic and Belle. "Dominic, you didn't tell me you had fancy clients now," he teased, his grin widening. "You upgrading the garage without letting me know?" Belle laughed lightly, disarming the moment. "Hardly a client," she said. "Just someone who got lucky finding a good mechanic." Dominic shot Jake a look. "Get back to work, Jake." Still chuckling, Jake disappeared, leaving Dominic and Belle in the awkward quiet of the garage. Belle's gaze wandered over the space, taking in the chipped paint, the patched flooring, and the mismatched tools. "You've got a real rustic setup here," she said diplomatically. Dominic smirked, crossing his arms. "That's one way to put it. It's not much, but it gets the job done." Belle tilted her head, her curiosity evident. "How long have you been running this place?" 5 years, Dominic replied. "Bought it when things were better. Thought I'd build it up into something bigger, but life happens." Belle's expression softened, her gaze shifting to a dusty shelf lined with worn tools and half-empty oil cans. "Life happens," she echoed, almost to herself. "And yet you keep going. That's admirable." Dominic shrugged, unsure how to respond to the unexpected compliment. "You do what you have to. This place keeps the lights on, most of the time." His voice carried a tinge of humor, but the weight behind his words was evident. Belle's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she set the basket down on the nearest counter. "You mentioned something the other day," she began carefully, "about wanting to make this place bigger. What stopped you?" Dominic leaned against a workbench, wiping his hands again as if trying to scrub away the vulnerability creeping into the conversation. "A lot of things. My wife passed away not long after I bought this place. Alice was still a toddler. Everything I had went into making sure she was okay. Big dreams. They didn't feel as important anymore." Belle's posture shifted, her usual poised confidence giving way to something more thoughtful. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. "That must have been a lot to carry." "It is," Dominic admitted, his voice quieter now. "But Alice makes it worth it. She's the reason I get up every morning, even when things are tough." He straightened, attempting to steer the conversation away from himself. "Enough about me. What about you? What brings someone like you to a town like this?" Belle hesitated, her polished demeanor faltering ever so slightly. "I needed a break," she said finally. "Things have been hectic lately. Sometimes it's good to get away." Dominic raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to her story, but he chose not to press. "Well, if you're ever stuck again, you know where to find me." A faint smile tugged at Belle's lips. "I'll keep that in mind." Her gaze returned to the garage, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "You know, with some upgrades, this place could really shine." Dominic chuckled, shaking his head. "Upgrades cost money, and I'm not exactly swimming in it." Belle didn't respond right away. Instead, she picked up a wrench from the workbench, turning it over in her hands as if weighing an idea. "Sometimes all it takes is someone to believe in you," she said softly. Dominic frowned, unsure how to interpret her words. Before he could reply, Jake reappeared, breaking the moment. "Boss, that alternator's done. You want me to start on the transmission next?" "Yeah, go ahead," Dominic said, his attention briefly shifting to Jake. When he turned back to Belle, she was already walking toward her car. "Thanks again, Dominic," she called over her shoulder, her tone light but carrying an undertone of something unspoken. "And enjoy the baked goods. You've earned them." Dominic watched as her car disappeared down the snowy road, the sound of its engine fading into the cold stillness. He stood there for a moment, the weight of her words lingering in the air. Sometimes, all it takes is someone to believe in you. As the doorbell jingled and another customer walked in, Dominic shook his head and returned to his work. But the seed of something new, a flicker of hope, perhaps, had already taken root. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garage as Dominic tightened the final bolt on an aging pickup truck. He stepped back to admire his work, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, and then turned his attention to the growing stack of unpaid bills sitting on his desk. The sight was a familiar one that seemed to weigh heavier with each passing week. "Boss," Jake called, breaking his thoughts. "We're out of brake fluid again. I'll run down to Carlson's tomorrow to restock." Dominic sighed. "Add it to the list. Let's hope Carlson's still willing to extend us credit." Jake gave him a sympathetic look, but didn't say anything further, knowing Dominic already had enough on his plate. The sound of an engine purring to a halt outside drew their attention. Dominic glanced through the smudged window and felt his stomach twist slightly. It was Belle. She stepped out of her car with her usual poise, a small envelope in hand. Dominic, she greeted with a smile, though her tone was serious. Do you have a minute? He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag and motioning toward the corner of the garage where an old folding chair sat. What's going on? Belle handed him the envelope. Before you say no, hear me out. I've arranged something for you. Dominic frowned, his rough fingers brushing the edges of the crisp envelope as he opened it. Inside was a formal letter inviting him to an interview at Carter Automotive Innovations, a name that was as familiar as it was intimidating. His stomach dropped. Belle, I don't think... She raised a hand to stop him. Just listen. I know this isn't what you're used to, but I see what you're capable of, Dominic. Your skill, your dedication, it's exactly what my company needs. This is more than just an opportunity for you. It's a chance to give Alice the life she deserves. Dominic's brow furrowed as he processed her words. Alice is happy. I'm doing the best I can. I know you are, Belle said gently, her eyes softening. But imagine what you could do if you weren't constantly worrying about making ends meet. This job could change everything for both of you. Dominic looked down at the letter again, the official logo and bold text staring back at him. His instinct was to refuse. The corporate world felt like an alien universe, one where he didn't belong. Yet Belle's words struck a chord. I'm not qualified for something like this, he said finally. I'm just a mechanic. And that's exactly why you're perfect, Belle countered. You solve problems in ways no one else can. My company needs people like you, people who think outside the box. The conversation was interrupted by Jake, who approached with a curious expression. Boss, everything okay? Dominic hesitated before folding the letter and tucking it into his pocket. Yeah, everything's fine. Belle glanced at Jake, then back at Dominic. Think about it, she said quietly. You have until tomorrow to decide. As Belle's car pulled away, leaving a trail of soft dust in its wake, Dominic leaned against the workbench, staring at the envelope in his hand. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as though the opportunity inside carried the gravity of all his doubts and fears. He let out a slow breath, crumpling the rag in his hand. Okay, boss. Spill, Jake said, crossing his arms and leaning casually against the counter. What did Fancy Car Lady have to say this time? Dominic gave him a sidelong glance. She wants me to interview at her company. For a managerial position, Jake's eyebrows shot up. Managerial? Like desk job, suits and ties? That doesn't sound like you, man. Tell me about it, Dominic muttered, tossing the rag onto the bench. She thinks I've got something to offer. Says it could change everything for Alice and me. Jake whistled low, shaking his head. Well, she's not wrong about that. But can you even imagine yourself in an office, dealing with spreadsheets and meetings? Dominic didn't answer immediately. He paced the garage, the familiar clatter of tools and faint hum of the air compressor grounding him in the reality of the world he'd built. It's not just about me, Jake. If I take this, I'd be leaving the garage behind. You'd be stuck running this place on your own. Jake waved a hand dismissively. I've been holding down the fort long enough. You don't need to worry about me. The real question is, what do you want? Forget the bills, the garage, even me. What do you want for you and Alice? Dominic stopped pacing, Jake's words sinking in. What did he want? It wasn't a question he allowed himself to consider often. His life revolved around making ends meet and ensuring Alice had what she needed. But Belle's offer stirred something unfamiliar. Possibility. That night, after Alice was tucked into bed and the house was quiet, Dominic sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread out before him. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead, and the stack of unpaid bills loomed in the corner. He ran a hand through his hair, then reached for the phone. Belle answered on the second ring, her voice calm and confident as always. Dominic, I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you. Let's say I'm considering it, he admitted, leaning back in his chair. What's the catch? There's no catch, she said simply. The interview is yours if you want it. You don't have to prove anything to me. I already know what you're capable of. This is about showing everyone else. Dominic hesitated, staring at the bills again. And if I don't fit in there, if it's a disaster, then you'll know you tried, Bell replied. And you'll still have your garage to come back to. But if you don't take the chance, you'll never know what could have been. He sighed, her words resonating more deeply than he cared to admit. Fine, I'll go. The next morning, Alice peeked around the corner as Dominic adjusted his collar in the mirror, wearing a button-up shirt she rarely saw him in. Where are you going, Dad? She asked, her voice curious. Just a meeting, kiddo, Dominic replied, crouching to her level. Something important. Are they going to pay you more? She asked, her eyes lighting up. Can we get the good cereal if they do? Dominic laughed, pulling her into a hug. Maybe, but don't get ahead of yourself. As he drove toward Denver, the mountains shrinking in his rear-view mirror, Dominic felt the tug of nerves in his chest. This wasn't his world, but for Alice, he would try. Whatever came next, he'd face it, head on. The Denver skyline loomed in the distance, its glass and steel towers shimmering in the morning sun. Dominic tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his palms damp with sweat despite the car's heater. He had dressed as neatly as he could manage, a pressed shirt and slacks borrowed from Jake's better wardrobe, but he still felt like an outsider entering a world that wasn't his. The GPS guided him through the bustling city streets, a sharp contrast to the quiet familiarity of Silver Ridge. Traffic lights, honking cars, and hurried pedestrians surrounded him. And for a moment, he wondered if this was all a mistake. But then he thought of Alice's wide-eyed excitement that morning, her simple question echoing in his mind. Can we get the good cereal? He couldn't let her down, not without trying. Dominic pulled into the parking lot of Carter Automotive Innovations, his eyes widening as he took in the sleek, modern building before him. Its facade of mirrored glass seemed to reach the clouds, the company's bold logo etched into a steel sign at the entrance. He swallowed hard and stepped out of the car, clutching the envelope Bell had given him like a lifeline. Inside, the lobby was a sea of polished marble and gleaming chrome. Employees in tailored suits moved with purpose, their polished shoes clicking against the pristine floor. Dominic suddenly felt every crease in his borrowed clothes, every scuff on his boots. He approached the reception desk, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Hi, I'm Dominic," he said. "I have an interview." The receptionist, a young woman with a sharp bob and an even sharper smile, typed quickly on her keyboard. "Of course, Mr. Dominic. You're here for the technical management position, correct?" Her tone was polite, but Dominic felt the weight of the words, technical management. Was he truly qualified for this? "Yes," he replied, his throat dry. She handed him a visitor's badge and pointed toward a set of elevators. "Conference room 17, 4th floor. Someone will meet you there." The elevator ride felt endless, the soft hum of the machinery doing little to calm his nerves. When the doors opened, Dominic stepped into a corridor lined with glass-walled offices, each filled with people who looked like they belonged. He didn't. Or at least, that's how it felt. At the conference room, a woman in a sleek grey blazer greeted him. "Dominic," she said warmly, extending a hand. "I'm Sophia Park, junior engineer. I'll be helping with your interview today." Her friendly demeanor eased some of his tension. "Nice to meet you," he said, shaking her hand. He followed her into the room, where two other individuals waited, a man with a calculating stare, Richard Blake, and a middle-aged woman typing furiously on a tablet. Dominic offered a polite nod to the two individuals in the room, though he couldn't ignore the cold, appraising look from Richard Blake. The man's suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, and his expression exuded skepticism as his eyes scanned Dominic from head to toe. "Dominic, is it?" Richard said, his tone as sharp as his appearance. "Welcome to Carter Automotive. I understand you're here at Ms. Carter's personal recommendation." Dominic shifted slightly, unsure whether the comment was meant as a compliment or a subtle dig. "That's right," he replied simply, meeting Richard's gaze with as much confidence as he could muster. The middle-aged woman glanced up from her tablet and introduced herself. "I'm Clara Mendoza, Director of Human Resources. We'll be evaluating both your technical and managerial capabilities today." Her tone was neutral but professional, and Dominic appreciated her straightforwardness. Sophia motioned for him to take a seat at the conference table, which was spotless and intimidatingly large. "Let's start with your background," she said, her voice encouraging. "Tell us about your experience and why you think you'd be a good fit for this role." Dominic cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Well, I've been running my own garage for 5 years. It's not much, but I've handled everything from managing repairs and inventory to dealing with customers and balancing the books. Before that, I worked as a mechanic for nearly a decade. Cars have been my life since I was old enough to hold a wrench." Richard raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Running a small-town garage is certainly different from managing teams or overseeing complex projects at a company like ours. Don't you think you might be out of your depth here?" The question hung in the air, and Dominic felt the weight of it press against his chest, but he refused to let it show. "Maybe," he admitted honestly. "But solving problems isn't about how big or small the setting is. It's about understanding what needs to be done and figuring out how to make it happen. I've spent my life doing that." Clara exchanged a glance with Sophia, her expression softening slightly. "And what about managing people? Have you led a team before?" "I have," Dominic replied. "At my garage, it's just me and my assistant, but I've had to train him, keep him motivated, and make sure we stay on track, even when the odds aren't in our favor. I know it's not the same scale, but I believe the principles are universal." Richard leaned forward, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Principles are one thing, but innovation is another. We're not just fixing cars here. We're redefining the future of the automotive industry. Can you handle that?" Dominic hesitated, unsure how to answer without sounding defensive. Before he could speak, Sophia interjected. "Dominic's perspective might be exactly what we need. Someone with hands-on experience who sees problems from a different angle." The room went quiet for a moment, tension simmering just below the surface. Clara finally broke the silence. "Let's move to the technical portion of the interview. Dominic, we'd like to hear how you'd approach a real-world scenario." As they began outlining the problem, Dominic leaned forward, his focus sharpening. This was his domain, and he knew he'd need to prove it. Dominic leaned against the workbench in his garage that evening, staring blankly at the clutter of tools and parts scattered before him. The interview had been grueling, far more intense than anything he'd anticipated. His hands, so steady when tightening bolts or calibrating engines, felt heavy as he recalled the pointed questions from Richard and the intimidating technical scenarios they'd thrown at him. He wasn't sure how he'd done. Clara and Sophia had seemed intrigued, nodding occasionally at his answers, but Richard's dismissive expressions lingered in his mind like a cloud. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long breath. Why had he even thought this was a good idea? This wasn't his world. It never would be. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts. Jake appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "You've been staring at that table for 10 minutes, he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Dominic replied, though the strain in his voice was evident. He picked up a wrench and turned it over in his hands, trying to focus on the familiar weight. Jake didn't buy it. "This about the interview?" he asked, crossing his arms. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Dominic let out a dry laugh. "Thinking about how I probably blew it, yeah. I'm not cut out for that kind of thing, Jake. Sitting in conference rooms, dealing with people like Richard Blake, it's not me." Jake tilted his head, his expression softening. "Maybe it's not. But didn't you go into that interview for Alice? For the chance to give her something more?" Dominic didn't respond right away. Instead, he set the wrench down and rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not just that," he admitted finally. "I wanted to see if I could do it, if I could be more than this." He gestured vaguely at the garage around him. Jake nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind Dominic's words. "Look, boss, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Not to Richard Blake, not to Belle, and definitely not to me. But if you want this, you've got to stop doubting yourself. You can't let some fancy suit guy like Richard get in your head." Dominic chuckled despite himself, appreciating Jake's blunt honesty. Before he could reply, the faint chime of his phone vibrating on the counter drew his attention. He picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the caller ID, Carter Automotive. Jake raised an eyebrow, gesturing for Dominic to answer. "Well, don't keep them waiting." Dominic hesitated for a moment before swiping to answer. "This is Dominic." "Mr. Dominic, this is Clara Mendoza from Carter Automotive," came the calm, professional voice on the other end. "We've reviewed your interview, and we'd like to offer you the position of technical manager. Congratulations." Dominic blinked, stunned into silence. Jake mouthed, "Well?" impatiently, but Dominic could only manage a faint, "Thank you." Dominic hung up the phone and stared at it, as if it might suddenly start talking again. Jake's voice snapped him out of his trance. "Well? What did they say?" "They offered me the job," Dominic said, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the words hit him all at once, like a wave crashing over him. "I got it." Jake let out a whoop, clapping Dominic on the shoulder. "That's amazing, boss. You see, I told you you could do it." He grinned, but his expression softened when he noticed Dominic's dazed look. "Hey, this is good news, right?" Dominic nodded slowly, his emotions a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Yeah, it is. It's just a lot to take in. I've never done anything like this before." "You'll figure it out," Jake said confidently. "You've been figuring things out your whole life. This is just a bigger playground." Dominic chuckled at that, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Yeah, a playground full of sharks like Richard Blake." Jake waved a hand dismissively. "Forget Richard. You've got this. And hey, I'll hold down the fort here. The garage isn't going anywhere." That night, Dominic sat at the kitchen table with Alice, her homework spread out before her as she scribbled on a math worksheet. She looked up at him, her big eyes filled with curiosity. "Dad, why are you smiling like that?" "I got the job," Dominic said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "The one I told you about." Alice's face lit up. "Does that mean we can get the good cereal now?" Dominic laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, kiddo, I think it does." She beamed, but then her expression turned serious. "Does this mean you won't work at the garage anymore?" His smile faltered as he considered how to answer. "It means I'll be working in a different place," he said carefully. "But it's a good thing, Alice. It means I can do more for us. For you." Alice seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. "Okay, but you'll still come home every night, right?" "Every night," Dominic promised, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "You and me, kiddo. That doesn't change." The next morning, Dominic stepped into Carter Automotive Innovations for his first day, his visitor's badge replaced with one bearing his name and new title, technical manager. The weight of it felt heavier than he expected, but he carried it with quiet determination. As he was being shown around by Sophia, who had taken it upon herself to ensure he settled in smoothly, they passed by Richard Blake. The man's calculating stare remained unchanged, but this time Dominic met his gaze with calm resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Dominic knew he belonged here, if not for himself, then for Alice. The hum of computers and the soft clatter of keyboards filled the open workspace on the third floor of Carter Automotive Innovations. Dominic stood at his assigned desk, a small but neatly arranged station near the edge of the floor. Compared to the cluttered chaos of his garage, this space felt cold and impersonal. A company-issued laptop and a sleek desk organizer were the only items in sight. Sophia Park appeared beside him, her warm smile breaking through his unease. "How are you settling in?" she asked, leaning casually against the edge of his desk. "Still getting used to it," Dominic admitted, fiddling with the edge of his laptop. "Feels a bit sterile." Sophia chuckled. "You're not wrong. Corporate life isn't exactly cozy, but you'll find your rhythm. Give it time." Before Dominic could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Park!" Richard Blake called from across the room, his tone clipped. "Shouldn't you be reviewing the prototype adjustments instead of giving tours?" Sophia's smile tightened, but she kept her tone polite. "I've already sent the latest updates, Mr. Blake. If you have concerns, we can discuss them." Richard didn't bother with a response, his eyes flicking briefly to Dominic before he turned and walked away. Dominic felt his shoulders tense, but Sophia rolled her eyes and gave him a reassuring pat on the arm. "Don't let him get to you. He thrives on making people feel out of place." "Good to know," Dominic muttered, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't used to this kind of passive-aggressive hostility. At the garage, if someone had a problem, they said it outright. Here, everything felt layered in subtle jabs and unspoken judgments. Sophia handed him a tablet. "Here, this has everything you'll need for your first assignment. We're working on the next phase of our electric vehicle prototype, and they want your input on optimizing the powertrain system." Dominic took the tablet, scanning the detailed schematics and technical notes. While the technology was far more advanced than anything he'd worked with before, the fundamentals were familiar. He nodded slowly, his confidence building. "I'll take a look." "Good," Sophia said, "and if you need anything, just ask. I'm here to help." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and technical discussions. Dominic felt like he was constantly trying to catch up, the pace of the corporate world far faster than he was accustomed to. By lunchtime, he was mentally exhausted, his head buzzing with acronyms and engineering jargon. As he sat alone in the cafeteria, a tray of barely touched food in front of him, he found himself missing the garage. The smell of motor oil, the feel of tools in his hands, and the easy camaraderie with Jake. But as he thought about Alice and her bright smile that morning, he reminded himself why he was here. This wasn't just about him. Dominic was lost in thought when Sophia slid into the seat across from him, carrying a small plate of food and a coffee. "Not the best lasagna, is it?" she said, gesturing toward his untouched tray. Dominic managed a small smile. "Not quite the home-cooked kind." Sophia took a sip of her coffee, studying him for a moment. "You seem overwhelmed," she said gently. "That's normal your first week here. It's a lot to take in." "It's not just that," Dominic admitted, leaning back in his chair. "Everything here feels different. The way people talk, the pace of it all. It's like they're speaking a language I barely understand." Sophia nodded. "Corporate life is its own beast, for sure, but you've got something most people here don't. Practical experience. You see problems differently because you've lived them." Dominic frowned, considering her words. "Doesn't feel like that's enough, though. Richard seems determined to remind me I don't belong." "Richard's not your measure of success," Sophia said firmly. Focus on what you bring to the table, not on his opinion of you. Trust me, you're here for a reason. Before Dominic could respond, the soft chime of a phone notification interrupted them. Sophia glanced at her screen, her expression darkening slightly. Speaking of Richard, she muttered, he's called an impromptu meeting in the conference room. Wants to discuss the powertrain adjustments? Dominic tensed, his appetite vanishing completely. What's the angle this time? Sophia shrugged, rising to her feet. Probably just another chance to flex his authority. Let's go. It's better to face him head-on. The conference room buzzed with quiet tension as Dominic and Sophia entered. Richard stood at the front, his arms crossed, a schematic of the prototype's powertrain displayed on the screen behind him. He glanced at Dominic, his smirk faint but noticeable. "Ah, Mr. Dominic," Richard said smoothly. "Just in time. I was hoping you could share your insights on the proposed adjustments. After all, Bell speaks so highly of your problem-solving skills." Dominic bristled at the thinly veiled jab, but stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the schematic. He studied it for a moment, the intricate details clicking into place in his mind. "The proposed adjustments might improve efficiency in the short term," he began, his voice steady. "But they'll create heat management issues down the line, especially under heavy loads." The room went quiet as Richard's smirk faltered, replaced by a more serious expression. "And your solution?" he asked, his tone sharper now. Dominic stepped closer to the screen, pointing at specific components. "Redesign the airflow channels here and upgrade the heat sinks. It'll cost more up front, but it'll prevent long-term damage and keep performance consistent." Sophia's eyes lit up, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's a solid approach," she said, breaking the silence. "And it's forward-thinking." Richard's jaw tightened, but he managed a curt nod. "We'll take it under consideration." As the meeting adjourned, Sophia leaned in close to Dominic. "See? Told you've got this." Dominic allowed himself a small smile, but as he walked back to his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wasn't done with him yet. The sound of Alice's laughter filled the house as Dominic set a plate of pancakes on the table. Her bright giggles echoed through the modest kitchen, her excitement palpable as she talked about the upcoming weekend. It had been a while since Dominic had seen her this happy, and he couldn't help but smile as he listened. "Dad, Miss Bell said she's taking us to the city park on Saturday," Alice exclaimed, her words tumbling out in a rush. "She said there's a carousel and a pond with ducks. Have you ever been to a park like that?" Dominic paused, his spatula mid-air. "Not quite like that, kiddo," he said, sitting down across from her. "But it sounds nice. Are you sure you're ready for all that excitement?" Alice grinned, her face lighting up. "I'm ready. Miss Bell said she'll bring snacks too. Can I feed the ducks?" Dominic chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see. Just don't feed them your pancakes." The weekend arrived faster than Dominic expected, and before he knew it, Bell's sleek car pulled up in front of their house. Alice bolted out the door, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders as she waved enthusiastically. "Miss Bell, I'm ready." Bell stepped out of the car, her usual polished demeanor softened by a warm smile. "Good morning, Alice," she said, crouching to greet her. "You're looking ready for an adventure." Dominic followed, feeling slightly out of place in the presence of Bell's effortless sophistication. "Morning, Bell," he said, his tone casual but polite. "Thanks for doing this. Alice has been talking about it all week." Bell glanced at him, her expression kind. "I'm happy to. She's wonderful company." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. "You're coming too, right?" Dominic hesitated. "I figured I'd let you two have your fun." Bell's brow furrowed slightly. "Alice would be disappointed if you didn't come. So would I." Before he could argue, Alice grabbed his hand, tugging him toward the car. "Come on, Dad. Miss Bell said there's a carousel. You have to see it. With a resigned laugh, Dominic climbed into the car, Alice chattering away in the back seat as Belle navigated the city streets. The park was bustling with activity, a kaleidoscope of colours and sounds that made Alice's eyes widen with wonder. She darted from one attraction to the next, her enthusiasm infectious. Dominic found himself relaxing as he watched her play. Belle stood beside him, her usual reserved air replaced by something lighter. "She's incredible," Belle said softly, her gaze fixed on Alice. "You've done a wonderful job with her." Dominic glanced at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "Thanks. She's my world." Belle nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It shows." As Alice ran ahead to the carousel, Belle and Dominic strolled behind, the hum of children's laughter and music filling the air. Dominic glanced at Belle, who seemed unusually quiet. She looked out over the park, her arms crossed loosely, as if deep in thought. "You okay?" Dominic asked, his tone gentle but curious. Belle hesitated before answering, her gaze still on the children playing by the pond. "I was just thinking about Alice," she said. "How happy she is. You've created a life for her that's so full of love, even with everything you've been through." Dominic shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "She makes it easy. She's got a big heart, just like her mum." Belle turned to him, her expression softening. "It's not easy, though, is it? Raising her on your own, running the garage, trying to make ends meet. You make it look effortless, but I know it's not." Dominic exhaled slowly, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability, especially from someone like Belle. "You do what you have to," he said simply. "For her, I'd do anything." Belle nodded, a small, thoughtful smile playing on her lips. "That's what I admire about you, Dominic. You don't give up no matter how hard things get." Her words lingered between them, and for a moment Dominic felt the walls he'd built around himself start to crack. He was about to reply when Alice's voice called out, breaking the moment. "Dad! Miss Belle, come ride the carousel with me." Alice stood by the entrance, waving excitedly. Dominic chuckled, giving Belle a small, sheepish smile. "I guess we've been summoned," he said. Belle laughed, the tension between them dissolving. "Looks like it." The carousel ride was a blur of laughter and light, Alice's giggles echoing as she rode her favourite horse. Belle and Dominic stood beside her, the simplicity of the moment reminding them both of the joy in life's smaller pleasures. Later, as they sat on a bench near the pond, Alice fed bits of bread to the ducks, her face lit with pure delight. Belle leaned toward Dominic, her voice low so Alice couldn't hear. "Thank you for letting me be a part of this. I don't get to experience moments like these often." Dominic looked at her, sensing the sincerity in her words. "You're welcome any time," he said, his voice steady. "Alice loves having you around. So do I." Belle's eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, the noise of the park faded, leaving just the two of them. Then Alice's voice broke through, pulling them back to reality. "Miss Belle! Dad! Look at this big duck!" she shouted, pointing enthusiastically. Both of them laughed, grateful for the distraction. As they drove home later, Alice asleep in the back seat, Belle glanced at Dominic. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "you're not as out of place in my world as you think." Dominic looked at her, a faint smile on his lips. "Maybe. But I think you're starting to fit into mine." The conference room buzzed with tension as engineers, managers and executives shuffled in, their expressions grim. Dominic sat near the edge of the room, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. The electric vehicle prototype, the cornerstone of Carter Automotive Innovation's next big launch, had encountered a critical flaw just days before its scheduled unveiling. The stakes, couldn't have been higher. Belle entered the room with her usual composed demeanor, though Dominic caught the flicker of concern in her eyes. She took her place at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping across the group. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calm but firm. "As you know, we've identified a serious issue with the powertrain system in the prototype. We need solutions, and we need them now." Richard Blake leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed and a faint smirk on his face. "With all due respect, Belle," he said, his tone laced with condescension, "it's not surprising we're in this position. When we start taking advice from people who lack the proper experience—" His eyes darted briefly to Dominic. "These kinds of oversights are inevitable." The room went silent, the tension palpable. Dominic felt his jaw tighten, but before he could speak, Belle cut Richard off with a sharp glance. "This isn't the time for finger-pointing, Richard. We need actionable ideas, not blame." Richard's smirk faded, and Belle turned her attention to the group. "Let's start with the facts. Sophia, can you summarize the issue?" Sophia stood, her voice steady as she explained. "During stress tests, we discovered that the powertrain system overheats under sustained high performance. This leads to a drop in efficiency and, in extreme cases, complete shutdown. If we can't address this, the vehicle won't meet safety or reliability standards." A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Dominic studied the schematic on the screen, his mind racing as he processed the details. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "It's not just the powertrain," he said. "The cooling system design is part of the problem. It's too centralized. The airflow can't keep up with the heat generated at high speeds." All eyes turned to him, some skeptical, others curious. Dominic stood, his nerves settling as his confidence grew. "If we reroute the cooling channels to distribute airflow more evenly, it'll reduce heat buildup in the powertrain. We'd also need to reinforce the heat sinks with higher capacity materials, but it's doable." Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That could work. But what about the timeline? Redesigning the cooling system would take weeks, and we only have days." Dominic hesitated, the weight of the deadline pressing down on him. Then an idea struck. "What if we don't redesign the entire system?" he said. "We focus on reinforcing the critical areas prone to overheating. It's not a permanent fix, but it'll stabilize the system enough to pass the tests." The room was quiet as everyone processed his suggestion. Belle broke the silence, her voice decisive. "Dominic, I want you to lead this. Work with Sophia and the engineering team to implement these adjustments. We'll meet again tomorrow for an update." The room began to clear as Belle wrapped up the meeting, but Dominic remained at the table, staring at the schematics on the screen. The weight of responsibility pressed on him. Leading a team at Carter Automotive was a far cry from fixing cars in his garage, and the thought of failure gnawed at the edges of his confidence. "You've got this," Sophia's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood next to him, her tablet tucked under one arm. "Your idea makes sense, and I'll help you see it through." Dominic offered a small, grateful nod. "Thanks, Sophia. It's just a lot." "It is," she agreed, pulling up a chair. "But you wouldn't be here if Belle didn't think you could handle it, and for what it's worth, I agree with her." Her words gave Dominic a momentary boost, enough to shift his focus back to the problem at hand. "All right," he said, leaning forward. "Let's map out what needs to be done." The next several hours were a whirlwind of calculations, blueprints, and heated discussions in the engineering lab. Dominic found himself in uncharted waters, surrounded by highly skilled engineers who were used to a different way of problem-solving. There were moments of friction. Technical jargon flew over his head, and some team members questioned his approach, but he held his ground. "This isn't about overhauling the system," Dominic said firmly during one particularly tense debate. "It's about stabilizing what we have so it works under stress. We're not reinventing the wheel here, we're reinforcing it." Sophia stepped in, backing him up with data and projections. Her support was instrumental in winning over the team, and gradually they began to rally around Dominic's plan. By the time the first adjustments were complete, it was well past midnight. Dominic stretched his arms and let out a deep sigh, exhaustion settling into his bones. Sophia handed him a cup of coffee, her own fatigue evident, but her determination unwavering. "One down," she said, giving him a tired smile. "Now we just need to test it." Dominic glanced at the prototype, its sleek body reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the lab. "It'll hold," he said, more to convince himself than anyone else. "It has to." The testing began early the next morning. Dominic watched anxiously as the prototype roared to life, its systems pushed to the limit. For the first time in days, a flicker of hope ignited as the cooling adjustments held steady, preventing the overheating that had plagued the system before. Belle arrived midway through the testing, her presence commanding as always. She watched from the observation window, her expression unreadable. When the test concluded successfully, a wave of relief swept through the room. "You did it," Sophia said, clapping Dominic on the back. Belle entered the lab, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. "Excellent work, Dominic," she said, her tone genuine. "You stepped up when it mattered most." Dominic nodded, his confidence bolstered, but tempered by the realization that this was just the beginning. Richard lingered in the background, his expression unreadable, but Dominic could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. As the team celebrated, Dominic took a moment to step outside, the crisp evening air a welcome reprieve from the high-stakes environment inside. He leaned against the wall, letting the cool breeze calm his nerves. Belle appeared beside him, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You should be proud," she said. "Not everyone can handle this kind of pressure." "I'm just glad it worked," Dominic replied, his tone humble. "There's still a lot to learn." Belle smiled, her usual poise softening. "You're learning fast, and you've already proven that you belong here." Her words stayed with him as he drove home that night, the city lights fading into the distance. For the first time since starting this journey, Dominic felt a spark of belief, not just in his abilities, but in the possibilities ahead. The hum of the office felt quieter than usual as Dominic sat at his desk, staring at the data from the recent prototype test. The numbers confirmed what the team had witnessed. The adjustments had worked, stabilizing the powertrain and cooling system. It was a victory, but the weight of the past few days lingered. Despite the success, Dominic couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, with every step scrutinized. Sophia appeared beside him, setting a cup of coffee on his desk. "You're still overthinking it," she said with a knowing smile. "We passed the test. You should be celebrating." Dominic chuckled, though his shoulders remained tense. "Celebrating doesn't come naturally when you're waiting for the other shoe to drop." Sophia raised an eyebrow, pulling up a chair. "Let me guess. Richard?" Dominic gave a small nod. "He's been quiet since the test. Too quiet. I don't trust it." Sophia sighed, her expression turning serious. "Richard isn't your problem, Dominic. He thrives on control, but Belle sees through him. You've already proven yourself where it matters most." "Maybe," Dominic said, glancing toward the hallway where Richard's office loomed. "But people like him don't just let things go." Before Sophia could respond, Belle's voice came over the intercom, calling for Dominic to meet her in her office. Sophia gave him an encouraging look. "Whatever it is, you've got this." Dominic made his way to Belle's office, the spacious room bathed in natural light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Belle was seated at her desk, but her expression was unusually contemplative. She gestured for him to sit. "Dominic," she began, her tone steady but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "I wanted to talk about the work you've done so far. It's been impressive, and you've exceeded every expectation." "Thank you," Dominic said, his voice careful. "That means a lot." Belle nodded, leaning forward slightly. "But I also wanted to talk about you. I've noticed you tend to downplay your contributions, and I think it's time you started seeing yourself the way others see you." Dominic frowned slightly, caught off guard by her words. "I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. This world is still new to me." Belle smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you belong here. You bring something we don't see enough of. Practicality, grounded thinking. It's a perspective this company needs." Before Dominic could respond, the door opened, and Richard stepped in unannounced. His expression was neutral, but there was an edge to his tone as he addressed Belle. "Am I interrupting?" Belle's gaze sharpened. "Yes, actually you are. What is it, Richard?" "There's a matter regarding the project budget that requires your attention," Richard said, though his eyes flicked briefly to Dominic. "It's urgent." Belle sighed, rising from her chair. "We'll continue this conversation later, Dominic." She glanced at Richard, her expression unyielding. "I trust this is truly important." As they left, Dominic sat back, his thoughts swirling. Something about Richard's timing felt calculated, and he couldn't shake the sense that trouble was brewing. Dominic returned to his desk, but his mind lingered on the encounter in Belle's office. Richard's sudden interruption hadn't felt coincidental. It was the look in his eyes, cold and calculating, that left Dominic uneasy. He tried to refocus on his work, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. Later that afternoon, Sophia appeared again, holding a tablet with a concerned expression. "Dominic, you need to see this," she said, her tone low. She handed him the tablet, and his stomach sank as he scanned the document on the screen. It was a report detailing budget overruns on the prototype project. At first glance, it looked damning, with cost increases attributed to the adjustments Dominic had proposed. The numbers painted a picture of mismanagement and poor planning, but Dominic knew they weren't accurate. "This doesn't make sense," Dominic said, his voice tight. "We stayed within the budget Belle approved. Where is this coming from?" Sophia leaned closer, her voice hushed. "I checked the original files. Someone's manipulated the data. It's subtle, but the discrepancies are there." Dominic's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. Richard?" Sophia gave a small nod. "I can't prove it outright, but the changes were made under his login. He's setting you up, Dominic." A mix of anger and frustration surged through him. He'd dealt with plenty of challenges in his life, but this was different. It wasn't just his reputation on the line, it was the trust Belle had placed in him, the chance to build something for Alice. He couldn't let it slip away. "I need to talk to Belle," Dominic said, standing abruptly. "If she sees this before I can explain—" "Wait," Sophia said, placing a hand on his arm. "Rushing in without evidence might do more harm than good. Let me help. I can dig deeper, find the original data, and trace the edits. But you need to stay calm." Dominic exhaled, forcing himself to nod. "All right. Let me know what you find." The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. Dominic tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting to the potential fallout. When he left the office that evening, the air felt heavier than usual, the city's lights blurred by the weight of his worries. At home, Alice greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, but even her bright smile couldn't completely lift his spirits. As he helped her with her homework, she paused and looked up at him, her small hand resting on his arm. "You okay, Dad?" Dominic forced a smile. "Yeah, kiddo. Just a long day." Her eyes searched his face for a moment before she nodded, satisfied. "You're still the best, though." Her words hit him like a lifeline, pulling him from the spiral of doubt. Whatever happened, he had to keep fighting. For her. The next morning, Sophia approached Dominic with a triumphant look. "I found it," she said, handing him the tablet. "The original data and the changes. It's all here." Dominic felt a surge of relief and determination. "Let's go talk to Belle." As they headed to her office, Dominic couldn't help but feel the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about standing up for himself, proving that he deserved to be here. And for the first time, he felt ready to fight for it. Dominic knocked on Belle's office door, the tablet clutched tightly in his hand. Sophia stood beside him, her expression calm but resolute. Inside, Belle's voice called, "Come in," and Dominic stepped through, his nerves humming with a mix of determination and unease. Belle looked up from her desk, her sharp eyes immediately registering the seriousness on their faces. "What's going on?" she asked, setting her pen down. Dominic hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Belle, there's something you need to see. It's about the budget reports for the prototype project." He handed her the tablet, and Sophia added, "The numbers in the official report don't match the original data. We traced the edits, and they were made under Richard's login." Belle's expression didn't change as she studied the screen, but Dominic could see the subtle tightening of her jaw. When she finally looked up, her voice was calm but edged with steel. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" "We double-checked everything," Sophia said. "The edits were deliberate. They were made to pin the budget overruns on Dominic's adjustments." Belle leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting momentarily to the window as she processed the information. "Richard's been with this company for a long time," she said finally, her voice measured. "But if what you're saying is true, this isn't just sabotage. It's a betrayal of everything this company stands for." Dominic felt the weight of her words and the implied trust behind them. "I didn't want to believe it either," he said. "But I can't let this slide, Belle. I've worked too hard to prove myself, and I won't let him tear it down." Belle nodded slowly, her focus shifting back to the tablet. "You did the right thing bringing this to me. I'll handle it." "Wait," Dominic said, surprising himself with his own boldness. "I want to be there when you confront him. This is about more than just me. It's about the team, the project, and what we're trying to build here." Belle studied him for a moment, and then a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "All right, Dominic, let's do this together." An hour later, Belle called a meeting in the main conference room. The key members of the project team, including Richard, were present, their expressions ranging from curious to uneasy. Dominic sat beside Belle, his shoulders squared, while Sophia took a seat across the table, her quiet confidence lending him strength. Belle opened the meeting with her usual composure, addressing the room with a firm but neutral tone. "We've made significant progress on the prototype, and I want to commend the team for their hard work. However, some discrepancies in the budget reports have come to my attention, and they require immediate clarification." Richard's expression barely flickered, but Dominic caught the subtle shift in his posture. Belle continued, her gaze sharp as it landed on him. "Richard, as the senior manager overseeing this project, can you explain why the financial data in the official report doesn't align with the original records?" Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said smoothly. "I've reviewed all the reports personally, and as far as I know, they're accurate." Belle slid the tablet across the table toward him. "Take a closer look." Richard picked up the device, his eyes scanning the screen. For a moment, his confident facade faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "There must be some mistake," he said, his tone defensive. "Perhaps someone else—" "Stop," Belle cut in, her voice like a whip. "The edits were made under your login, Richard. We've verified that. This isn't a mistake. It's deliberate." The tension in the room was palpable as Belle's words hung in the air. All eyes turned to Richard, his carefully composed mask slipping for the first time. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but Belle held up a hand, silencing him. "This company operates on trust and integrity," she said, her tone cold and unforgiving. "What you've done goes against everything we stand for. Manipulating data to undermine a colleague isn't just unprofessional. It's unethical. And it jeopardizes not only this project, but the reputation of everyone involved." Richard straightened, his voice laced with indignation. "I was acting in the best interest of the company. Dominic's adjustments were risky, and I didn't want them to derail everything we've built." Belle's eyes narrowed. "Don't insult my intelligence, Richard. If you had genuine concerns, you should have brought them to me directly. This wasn't about the company. It was about your ego." The room was silent, the weight of Belle's words pressing on everyone present. Dominic sat still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but he knew Belle had control of the situation. "Effective immediately," Belle continued, her voice cutting through the stillness. "You are relieved of your duties. HR will be in touch to discuss the terms of your departure." Richard's face turned pale, his confidence evaporating. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice trembling. "I've been with this company for over a decade. You can't just—" "I can," Belle interrupted, her tone unyielding. "And I will. This company needs leaders who build others up, not tear them down. Your actions have proven you're not fit to be one of them." Richard rose from his seat, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, it looked as though he might argue further, but the finality in Belle's expression left no room for negotiation. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. As the door closed behind him, Belle turned her attention to the team. "Let this be a reminder," she said, her tone softer now but still firm. "We succeed or fail as a team. Integrity and collaboration are non-negotiable. Dominic's contributions have been instrumental in getting us this far, and I expect all of you to treat him and each other with respect moving forward." The room nodded in agreement, a renewed sense of unity settling over the group. Belle glanced at Dominic, a faint smile breaking her otherwise serious expression. "Dominic? Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Your commitment to this project and this team hasn't gone unnoticed." "Thank you," Dominic said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "I'm just glad we can move forward." That evening, as Dominic packed up for the day, Sophia caught up with him near the elevator. "You handled that well," she said, her tone admiring. "Not everyone would have stood up to someone like Richard." Dominic gave a small shrug, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't do it alone. I had you and Belle backing me up." Sophia smiled. "Still, it takes guts. You've proven you belong here, Dominic." As the elevator doors opened, Dominic stepped inside, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time since joining Carter Automotive, he felt like he truly belonged. And as the city lights blurred past the glass, he realized he wasn't just fighting for a place in this world, he was building one. The grand opening of Dominic's newly revamped garage was just days away, and the air buzzed with a mix of excitement and anticipation. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of renovations, planning, and preparation. What had once been a run-down space with patched floors and mismatched tools was now a modern facility, complete with state-of-the-art equipment and a training area for young mechanics. Dominic stood in the center of the garage, surveying the transformation. The walls gleamed with fresh paint, and the new logo, Dominic's Garage and Training Center, was proudly displayed above the entrance. He felt a deep sense of pride, though the enormity of what he'd built still felt surreal. "Looks good, boss," Jake said, walking over with a clipboard in hand. He'd been instrumental in keeping the day-to-day operations running smoothly during the transition, and his easy grin was as reliable as ever. "I'd say we're just about ready for the big day." "Just about," Dominic agreed, though his tone was tinged with nerves. "I just want everything to go right. This isn't just a garage anymore. It's a second chance for me and a lot of other people." Jake nodded, his expression softening. "You've done something incredible here, Dom. Don't forget that." As they spoke, Belle's car pulled into the lot. She stepped out, her polished demeanor as striking as ever, though today there was a certain warmth in her smile. She waved as she approached, a tablet in her hand. "Dominic, Jake," she greeted. "This place looks amazing. It's hard to believe it's the same garage." "That makes two of us," Dominic replied with a chuckle, "but I couldn't have done it without your support." Belle glanced around, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't just invest in this place because of its potential. I invested because of you. Your vision, your determination. It's inspiring, Dominic." Dominic felt a flicker of embarrassment but pushed it aside. "Well, let's hope it pays off. There's still a lot riding on this." "It already has," Belle said, her voice firm. "You've created something real here, and you're going to make a difference." As they walked through the garage, Belle's words stuck with Dominic. He thought of Alice and the sacrifices he'd made to get to this point. This wasn't just about fixing cars anymore. It was about building a future for her and creating opportunities for others who needed a second chance, just like he had. Later that evening, as the team wrapped up for the day, Dominic sat in the quiet of the office, reviewing the final checklist. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Grayson stepped inside, her familiar smile lighting up the room. "Dominic," she said, holding out a plate of cookies. "Thought you could use a little encouragement before the big day." Dominic laughed, accepting the plate gratefully. "Thanks, Mrs. Grayson. You've always believed in this place, even when it was falling apart." She patted his shoulder. "That's because I believed in you. And now, look at what you've done. The whole town is talking about it." Her words brought a lump to Dominic's throat. For so long, he'd been focused on just getting by. Now, he was finally seeing the impact of his efforts, not just for himself, but for the community. The morning of the grand opening arrived, and the garage lot was alive with activity. Balloons swayed in the breeze, a ribbon stretched across the entrance, and a small crowd began to gather. Friends, neighbors, and even a few familiar customers had come to celebrate, their excitement filling the air. Dominic stood near the entrance, adjusting his tie, something he rarely wore but figured the occasion called for. Alice darted through the crowd, her face glowing with excitement. "Dad, look! Miss Belle brought the fancy cupcakes," she exclaimed, pointing to a table set up with refreshments. Belle, standing by the table in a smart but casual outfit, gave him a wave. Jake approached, a clipboard in hand, but his usual teasing grin was replaced with something softer. "You ready for this?" he asked. "Not really," Dominic admitted, though there was a smile tugging at his lips. "But I don't think I ever will be." Jake clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. That means you care." As the crowd settled, Belle stepped forward to introduce Dominic. She held the microphone with ease, her voice carrying over the excited murmurs. "Thank you all for coming today," she began, her tone warm. "This isn't just a celebration of a garage, it's a celebration of what's possible when hard work and heart come together." Her gaze shifted to Dominic, and she smiled. Dominic has poured his soul into this place, and it's not just about fixing cars, it's about fixing lives, giving people a chance to learn, to grow, and to dream. I'm honored to have been a small part of his journey. The crowd erupted into applause as Belle gestured for Dominic to step forward. He hesitated for a moment, then took the microphone, his hands steady despite the surge of emotions. "Thank you, Belle," he began, his voice rough with sincerity. "And thank you to all of you for believing in me, even when I wasn't sure I believed in myself. This place has always been more than just a garage to me. It's a place where people can come together, where we can work hard, make mistakes, and keep moving forward." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Alice, her small face beaming with pride. "This is for my daughter," he said, his voice softening. "For Alice, and for everyone who needs a second chance. Because I've learned that no matter how hard things get, there's always a way forward if we're willing to fight for it." The applause was thunderous as Dominic stepped back, his heart full. He cut the ribbon with Alice by his side, and the crowd surged forward to explore the newly transformed space. Throughout the day, Dominic moved between conversations, accepting congratulations and sharing stories with friends and strangers alike. The garage hummed with life, every corner filled with laughter and connection. Belle lingered nearby, her presence a quiet but steady support. As the sun began to set, the crowd thinned, leaving Dominic with a moment of quiet reflection. He stood by the entrance, looking out at the fading light. Belle joined him, her hands tucked into her pockets. "You did it," she said simply, her voice carrying a note of admiration. Dominic turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without you." Belle smiled, a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You've always had it in you, Dominic. I just helped you see it." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the journey they'd taken together settling between them. Then Alice ran up, tugging on Dominic's arm. "Dad, can we go inside and see the training area again?" Dominic laughed, scooping her up. "All right, kiddo, let's go." As they walked back into the garage, the bright lights casting a warm glow over the space, Dominic felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that this was only the beginning. The weeks following the grand opening of Dominic's garage and training centre were a whirlwind of activity. Word had spread quickly throughout the town and beyond, drawing not only customers but also young apprentices eager to learn from Dominic. The garage, once a symbol of struggle, now stood as a beacon of hope and opportunity. Dominic was busier than ever, dividing his time between training new mechanics, managing the business, and ensuring every customer left satisfied. Yet, despite the long hours and constant demands, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dominic sat at his workbench, surrounded by the hum of the garage. Alice was nearby, colouring at a small desk he'd set up for her. She hummed quietly to herself, the simple sound grounding him in the moment. "Dad?" Alice asked, looking up from her drawing. "Yeah, kiddo," Dominic replied, glancing over. "Do you think Mum would be proud of all this?" she asked, her voice filled with childlike curiosity, but carrying a weight beyond her years. Dominic paused, his throat tightening. He set down the wrench he'd been holding and turned to face her fully. "I think she'd be more than proud," he said softly. "She'd be amazed. Not just at the garage, but at you. You're the best part of all of this, Alice." Alice beamed, her smile lighting up the room. "I think she'd like Miss Belle, too." Dominic chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Yeah, I think she would." As if on cue, the sound of Belle's car pulling into the lot reached them. Alice jumped up, her excitement palpable. "Miss Belle is here!" Dominic followed her outside, wiping his hands on a rag as Belle stepped out of her car, holding a folder. She looked as poised as ever, but there was a softness to her smile that Dominic had grown to recognize. "Busy as always, I see," Belle said, nodding toward the lit garage. "You could say that," Dominic replied, his tone light. "What brings you by?" Bell handed him the folder. "I thought you'd want to see this. It's the final paperwork for the training center's grant program. You'll officially be able to offer scholarships to apprentices who need financial support." Dominic opened the folder, scanning the documents. "This is incredible. I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll keep doing what you're doing," Bell said. "You've already changed so many lives, Dominic. This is just the beginning." He looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. "You've done more for this place than I could have ever imagined. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Belle smiled, her gaze steady. "You already have. Watching this place grow, seeing what you've built, it's more than enough." Alice tugged at Belle's hand, pulling her toward the garage. "Come see what we've been working on," she said excitedly. Belle laughed, letting herself be led inside. Dominic followed, his heart full as he watched the two of them together. Inside, the garage buzzed with life. Jake was explaining a repair to one of the new apprentices. Mrs. Grayson was chatting with a customer in the waiting area, and the smell of oil and fresh paint mingled in the air. It was chaotic, but it was home. Dominic stood back for a moment, taking it all in. This was the life he'd dreamed of, the life he'd fought for, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe he deserved it. As the evening unfolded, the garage began to quiet. The apprentices finished their tasks and headed home. Jake packed up his tools for the night, and Mrs. Grayson waved goodbye with her usual cheery smile. Soon, it was just Dominic, Alice, and Belle, the soft hum of the overhead lights filling the space. Alice had found her way back to her desk, meticulously coloring a picture she insisted was a welcome sign for new apprentices. Dominic and Belle stood near the workbench, leaning against it as the silence between them stretched comfortably. "This place feels alive," Belle said finally, her voice low but warm. "It's more than just a business now. It's a community." Dominic nodded, his eyes scanning the garage. "That's what I wanted. A place where people feel they belong, where they can build something, not just cars, but their lives." Belle glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "And what about you? What are you building for yourself?" The question caught him off guard, and he hesitated, turning the wrench in his hands. "I've spent so much time trying to keep things together, I guess I haven't thought much about what's next for me." Belle stepped closer, her voice softening. "Maybe it's time you did." Dominic looked at her, and for a moment the weight of all they'd been through together hung in the air. She'd been more than an investor. She'd been a partner, a guide, and in many ways the person who'd believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself. "I think you're right," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I think what's next isn't just about me. It's about Alice, this place, and maybe even you." Belle smiled, a warmth spreading across her face. "I think I'd like that." Before either of them could say more, Alice bounded over, holding up her finished drawing. "Look, it's for the new apprentices," she said proudly, her eyes shining. Dominic crouched down, taking the paper in his hands. It was a colourful depiction of the garage, complete with smiling figures and a bright sun overhead. "It's perfect, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They're going to love it." Belle knelt beside them, her gaze soft. "You've got a pretty incredible dad, you know that?" she said to Alice. Alice nodded enthusiastically. "I know. He's the best." Dominic smiled, pulling Alice into a hug. For all the struggles, all the doubts, this was what it was about: family, connection, and building something that mattered. As the night deepened, the three of them stood together in the heart of the garage, the space that had come to represent not just hard work, but hope and possibility. And as Dominic looked around, he realized that the road he'd traveled, winding, difficult and uncertain, had led him exactly where he needed to be.